Hello, everybody. Rich, thank you so much for that introduction. And really, I want to thank you and your team for putting together this opportunity for me to present my research. I should also thank the University of Southern California for making this all possible, without which I wouldn't be in California. I'd still be in Wisconsin or Texas or Florida, my other home states. Yeah, it's true. I feel foolish, but I'm coming to Sacramento to talk about taxes. That's a dangerous thing to do. Demographers, we know everything. We know that in 10 years' time, everybody in this room is going to be 10 years older. And from that one fact, you can build a lot of evidence. And so I really want to show you what we found out. And this research is really sponsored by the Haynes Foundation in Los Angeles, part of a larger project on political demography of California and how it's changing. Here's the basic outline. We're going to be looking at the trauma of '78, which is where did it all start from, and then subsequent trends after that, going back, looking at the historical census data and other evidence, and then the basic challenge of how do we see ahead into the future? Where are we going now? And what does a slower house price trend in particular, what does that mean? Because this is a new world we've entered into, and then some final thoughts on charting our future course. I'm going to be asking you what you think at that point, because I really don't know the future. I only know that a few little parts of it. Here's the basic problem with taxes. No one really likes taxes. I don't like taxes. And the biggest problem is that the people who pay the taxes are different from those who consume the taxes. And it's all based on age. I'm a demographer. Here's the per capita contributions of taxes by age. Here's the per capita consumption or spending by age. These are data produced by Ron Lee at Berkeley, very respected economic demographer. And that's the problem. There's a disconnect between the taxpayers and the tax consumers. The problem in California is we have a demographic change going on where we have ethnic diversity, and the people who are at the older ages tend to be the non-Hispanic whites, people at the younger ages tend to be Latino, and they don't necessarily feel connected by kinship because it's different people's kids who are consuming those taxes. And if we don't solve that problem in our perceptions, then we have this disconnect that will continue. But it's structural, and we have to figure out a way around that. And I think we'll see some evidence, I hope, today. When it comes to Prop 13, there's another dimension to it, which is people don't know what it is. They're really not familiar with Prop 13. There seems to be support. This is based on how long you lived in your house, over 30 years, and this is less than 5 years in your house. These are data from the field poll that Mark DiCamillo has produced. And you see the percent who would vote for Prop 13 again. If they had another chance now, would they vote for it again? It's pretty constant across these different ages, or different durations. But the ones up here are very familiar. This is the dashed lines, the percent who say they're very familiar with Prop 13. And down here, the people who are more recent buyers, they don't know a lot about it. The old timers remember it well, and they think they know a lot. The young people don't. And in fact, under age 40, Mark DiCamillo says that about 40% don't even answer the question. They don't even know how to answer the question because they really aren't familiar with what Prop 13 is. It's been inherited, and it's actually a whole bundle of things, so there's confusion. And that's behind it all, too. Both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, were both objecting to taxes. And they were both proposing solutions. It wasn't as one-sided as we might think it was. It was very unanimous. And it just happened that the Prop 13 package is the one that got passed and put into law and has stayed with us all this time. But people were rethinking Prop 13 because of that, and also because of the budget crisis in Sacramento, frankly, where people are saying that no stone should be unturned, even though we all know it's the third rail or the sacred cow of politics in California. I mean, we have to look at it. And my particular impetus for looking at this was the house price crash. I've been a housing expert my whole career. I started off looking at the baby boomers when they were young buyers, and now I'm tracking them as they become old sellers. Not yet, but coming up soon. And this house price crash really overturns the apple cart. It's the foundation for Prop 13, and I'll show you the evidence on that. So here's some questions for us to ponder. What were they thinking or fearing at the time that they passed the law? The proposition had support, but why? And why did they assume that the new home buyers should carry all the freight? What was that about, other than the obvious point that the new home buyers weren't here yet and couldn't vote? Aside from that, really, how did they think it was going to work? The law, is a moment in time, but then it lasts for 30 years. And it's after 30 years that you question. And why do new buyers accept this system? How do they go along with that? And what is this 40% crash? What is that really going to mean? And then we should ask, what is fair and in the interest of the majority of voters? And then the big question, which I don't have the answer to, but we should all wonder about, which is, where the heck are we going as a state? And everybody is asking that question today, and and none of us knows quite for sure. But maybe we'll know a little bit more after today. So let's go back to the trauma of 78, as I call it, because it really was shocking what was going on then. Now, there's a story that goes along with this trauma of 78. And the story is pretty simple. It says that there was really high inflation and runaway house prices and this shocking and abusive increase in taxes. All these are true. These are all true points, and I'll show you the data. And there was an unfair burden being placed on the older generation. I don't have data on that, but that's alleged, and here it must be true. What's not talked about is that everybody was then enjoying at that time the fruits of all the previous investment that had gone down in the 1960s, and we're living fat and happy at that moment. And I myself went to UC Berkeley, so I was a beneficiary. And then we also have all of the growth in California was by migrants who were from out of state. Now, it might be a little risky for me to ask this question right now because in this room, I don't know, but I'm curious how many people in this room were not born in California? Well, a lot of you, okay, but a lot of you were born here, so this is a little bit of an unusual sample. About 2/3, 3/4 were not born in California over age 40. So this is the narrative that was told, and we should go back and we should, I think, review it. And I'm not going to overturn it, I'm going to say it's true. But let's look at the evidence to see that we understand it. And this is for the Consumer Price Index. This is inflation from 1950 to, 2009. And you see that there was a real spike, and this is the window of time here when we were deciding about Prop 13. And inflation was just really much higher than it had been, and people were spooked by it. It was definitely a problem. I sat in gas lines in 1973, and around the block. So it was a shaky time in history for everybody. That's inflation. Now, on top of inflation, let me show you what happened to house prices net of inflation. And here is this data I borrowed from Robert Shiller, who is the guru of the housing bubble. He does these long-term price trends. And real prices were flat in the United States. And this is an index, so it's just taking inflation out, no change in house prices. California was also flat until all of a sudden, after 1970, house prices just took off. In the U.S., it blipped up a little bit, but this is California. We doubled our prices. That was a real shocker. And then that's what people saw. They'd been through a period of flat prices, and then they saw this runaway situation. And so what would you think if you were back then? What did you think about what was going to happen with taxes? Well, at that moment, they had shifted over to a new taxation system where we're required to assess at full value, and they were assessing at 2.6% of full value, and values were skyrocketing. What that would produce was tax bills that went up 60% every 2 years. And people were flipping out. And now here's the 2.6%. And people, in my book, I have a principle I elaborate called extrapolated expectations. People assume basically that the recent trend is going to continue, and they just extrapolate it. Usually people are reacting to the trend that they imagine is going to happen. Not just what did happen, but if you listen to what they say, it's what's going to happen because of that trend if it continues. And they'll extrapolate it. They do that with everything. House prices are the most famous example. And Shiller himself has done surveys and looks at people, and in down markets, people assume it will stay down for 10 years at the same rate. And in up markets, by God, they assume the same rate of increase for 10 years in the future, which it's never happened. But people assume that. It's a human fallacy. Or not fallacy, it's a human failing. So that's one option. Then perhaps instead of going with 2.6%, we could do something more reasonable, like 1%. And it's still a big extrapolation that people might assume. So the only way to fix all that is to cap it and not let it rise. And then maybe you could have the taxes stay down at a reasonable level, which is sort of what they were back in 1970, and keep it down. And so in fact, Prop 13, I think, spoke to this and addressed this concern and offered this option instead of that one. This is the option that's still talked about today by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. When they talk about savings, their savings are based on 2.6% tax rate on an extrapolated house value. So what are some possible solutions? There were a number of things that were being floated at the time. There was circuit breaker plans in different parts of the country, a lot of options, but Isaac Martin talks about this as a bundle of policies that was adopted. It just happened to be the one that hit the right moment in timing. It had failed, other initiatives had failed in the previous couple of years, but this time it hit it just right, and it did all these things. And it didn't do just one thing. Prop 13 did multiple things. And the interesting what I found most interesting in the last 6 months is to realize how little people know about the scope of Prop 13. And they don't know that it covers commercial and residential, or they think it covers Prop 8 also. That Prop 8 is Prop 13. They don't know that Prop 8 is the decline in value temporary reassessment. They think that's they think everything, all California policy is called Prop 13. And so you can't argue against it because then you're arguing against the world. But in general, everybody does support Prop 13. Well, there's two structural flaws. I'll just point out two. One is that the 2% assessment increase and holding it in perpetuity is kind of defying the reality of inflation. It says we're not going to take this inflation. We're just going to say no. We're just going to go 2% and hold that for a long time. In fact, in the 30 years since, inflation ran at a little over 4%. So you're basically letting taxes, you're setting them so they're going at half the rate of inflation. There's no way you can keep a boat afloat like that. You've got holes in it, it's leaking water, and it's just going to go down if you fall behind. So you capped it, but capped it at a very low level. And then further, my bigger point here is that the whole thing is based on the foundation of assuming ever-rising house prices. That's the key idea. That's what was the motivator in the 1970s. Ever-rising house prices. They were scared to death that was going to go through the ceiling. And it did go through the ceiling. It went up more than 100%. And then it slacked off, and then it rose again. Well, I'll show you the data on that. Let's see what we have here. Let's look at the subsequent trends. What then happened going forward from this time of decision? What did happen? Here's what we saw originally, and here is the eventual trend. This is net of inflation. Here's Shiller's prices continued out. You see the U.S. had a little blip here in the late 70s, and a little blip in the late 80s, and then a big one recently. But this is nothing compared to California, where we had the big rise in the 70s, and then another big one in the 80s, late 80s, the big crash during the 90s, and then the whopper. And this is like, we don't know where the bottom is exactly. The current data are suggesting there's a 3-month trend of an uptick in these real prices. So here's the picture again now of house prices, but now I've overlaid on it several different acquisition cohorts, houses that were purchased in different years, and with a 2% assessment, the maximum rate of increase projected out for each of them. You remember in 1978, there was a rollback to 75, so these people actually fell down to this level of assessment, and then it creeped up like that. Their house values are like 84,000. Their assessments are 84,000 now. And then people more recently started out there, and their assessment would be to there. I bought a house here once in 1988, and I went through this hole. We'll come back to the hole where I was, well. And then more recently, I survived. But more recently, there's people here, and their assessments are trending up like this, or God forbid, you bought a house in 2006. And that's where Prop 8 is providing some relief for them. But we'll come back to what it means in the future. But this is the trend that has occurred. Now, I think you can't understand California if you don't look at the U.S. We'll just look at the whole U.S. And here is data we constructed for 1980. The census did not ask exactly about property taxes in 1980. They started that in 1990, but we tried to reconstruct it. And here's the U.S. And it's this is house values is the dark line, and then the property taxes are the white dots, and they're over here. So they're set at 1% of the house values. That's how the scale is set. It's pretty flat. In the U.S., it does not matter if you bought it recently or a long time ago. Taxes are the same for everybody. And that's the way it is in California, pretty much there too, in 1980, right after the proposition passed. Here it is in 1990, we have a gap starting to open up. The US remains flat and constant. And here in 1990, you see that the old timers are getting an advantage. They're still stuck with enjoying a low assessment, where the new people are paying higher, and house values are floating up for everybody. And this gap in here is an interesting gap to watch. In 2000, it floats a little bit more, and then more recently, in 2007, we have the big separation where house values are way up and the old timers are way down here. And the point I make in my paper, which has been published, is that this number here of taxes in California is now lower than what these people pay out here. So Californians enjoy lower taxes and way higher housing wealth. So there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of what is fair. And meanwhile, the young people are being caught having to pay huge mortgages and also the highest taxes. So here's the demographics that comes into it. You want to know who's actually paying and who's not. Oh, and how does California rank? This is 2008 data that were released. These data were made available really just last week. So I got it for 2008, and it shows California's ranking, how we look here. And this is based on recent buyers and after 2004, and then a long time ago buyers. And their house values are ranked at number 2 in the nation, behind Hawaii. Except for here, the old timers are number 1. They beat Hawaii. And their tax rank, the recent buyers are the second highest in the nation, behind New Jersey. And you see how by the time you get down to the old timers, they're 24th rank. I forget who they're after, Alabama or somebody. And as a percentage, you see that taxes were 74% higher for the new buyers, and they're 24% below the national average for the old timers. That's just the ranking in the nation. So it's useful to see California in some perspective like that. But better is to look at it demographically and see, okay, well, who's paying what? And this is all among the homeowners. And what we have here is the percentage, or the dollars that are being paid, the difference between 1% of their market value, and the market value is what they report, the reported value in the American Community Survey census data, and the actual taxes they report. And you see that these people have a little bit of a benefit. These other folks have a huge benefit because they've been there so much longer. That's based on occupancy or acquisition year. Here is based on age, and it's young people and the older people. And the interesting thing here is there's not a big racial difference. The older, the white homeowners have a little bit of an advantage, and other groups have a disadvantage because they bought more recently, but it's not that big a difference, is it? The real difference is generational, because that's the design of the policy. And the way I look at it is there's a subsidy going on. There's a tax subsidy. It's not from government. It's a tax subsidy from one group of homeowners to another group of homeowners. And basically, it's these new buyers are having to basically cover everybody else's discounts. The new buyers come in at the high prices. They pay the high taxes, and they cover the discounts for the other folks. Or it's the young people who bought more recently who cover the discounts for the older folks. So there's a question of fairness to consider, of course. So how do we even see the future? We had this trauma of '78, and there's another narrative now, I think, that we can see, because the demographics have not stayed still for 30 years. We have a much different population than we had then. And so the second narrative matches up to the first one item by item, and it showcases the differences that really have occurred. Whereas we used to have high inflation, we now have low inflation. Whereas we used to have runaway house prices, now we have, I hope, slowly rising house prices. Whereas we used to have abusive and shocking tax increases, I think we have moderate, steady increases that are possible. Maybe not. Maybe they're constant. Whereas we used to have unfair burdens on the older generation, well, those older generation now have high house values that they're selling, and they have high profits. So they're not poor, they're rich. And I should say also that the young people who were buying homes here are now struggling to buy homes here, and also pay the higher taxes to cover the older folks. So that's an interesting problem. Then further, I won't go into this too much, but there was the fruits of prior investment that were assumed before, and now some people say that there's a deficit of past investment and a shortage of public services. We can debate that no end, but what I'll show you instead is different data about the increases that lie ahead, which are based on changing demography, which we can be somewhat sure of. So there is a shift in outlook from having lots of public investment to having possibly a shortage coming. And then finally, we used to have growth by migrants. That was how California was driven. And now the growth is due to children. The 3/4 of the growth is from children, not from migration. The percentage of people who are homegrown, native-born Californians is now a majority. Since 2002, it's been a majority of our state. And that's the first time in history. Always before we were migrants from other states and other lands. Now we have a homegrown state. And that implies a different set of responsibilities than we've had before. It's a new outlook. So this narrative here suggests that things are different. How different? Well, let's take this one matter of the senior ratio, which I had opportunity to first present to Congress a couple of years ago. I was trying to figure out how to boil down a report to something they could understand, and it came up with this ratio. Some people call it the old age dependency ratio. The number of the people aged 65 and older divided by working age, who I term here 25 to 64. People under 25 or apprentices, or they're interns, or they're in school, or your kids under 25. They're not really able to support seniors. over 25 perhaps. But the point here is that this ratio has been virtually constant for 4 decades. And anything that is constant, we think is normal. It's invisible. It's like the blue sky. Totally invisible. You can't see it. Take it for granted. So you want to see what's going to happen in the next 10 years? I know you do. The next 20 years, this ratio is going to go up 73%. And that's a heck of a kick. It goes up in every state in the nation. The smallest increase I can find is in Oregon, where it goes up 50%. And the nation as a whole goes up 67%. So ours is starting lower because we have a younger population and it's going to rise. Well, whatever it is old folks do, older folks, whatever I'm going to do when I get to be that age is different than working age. I mean, I drive slow or you name it. But the thing I'm most concerned about is older folks sell houses and younger folks buy houses. This balance is out of whack. This is a serious problem. We're going to have too many sellers and not enough buyers. And in my bio, it does mention an article that was published last year in the Journal of American Planning Association that highlights this aging baby boomer problem and that generational housing bubble. It's a serious concern. That's just one factor, but the older folks also get pensions. A lot of them are state-funded pensions. It's tipping the balance here, and this is the issue that dominates social policy, domestic policy in America. And it's not talked about a lot because politicians, one principle I learned a while back is they'll never identify a problem if they don't have a solution in their back pocket. No one has a solution to this. You can't stop aging. So they won't mention it. Although you see it's there in Social Security, it's there in Medicare, all these problems are being, the thrust is driven by this ratio. It's as simple as that. You can't, no administration can wish it away. We need to have some, I think, responsible solution to how to handle it. Now, a second change that's going on in California is this rise of the homegrown generation. First, these are the adults, the people over 25. And you see that in 1970, for example, here, about 22% were homegrown Californians. And today it's up, well, this is actually last year, or 2007, it's like 37%. And this year is probably 39% homegrown. It's rising. And that tipping towards the homegrown is very different. If you were born here in California, it means a few things. It means, first off, your mother was here. She had to be here when you were born here. Your family is rooted here. Your high school friends are here. It changes your whole network of associations. Lots of things are different because of this ratio. I see it as positive news that we have a homegrown population. My kids can't imagine living anywhere else. They are staying here, they say. They don't, I had one son went off to Italy last year. He came running back so fast. He did not like Italy. He wanted to go back to California. They go to the East Coast or the Midwest and they're shocked. They're Californians. They have no roots anywhere else, and they are committed to the future. So this is the adults. Here's the young people. And the young people, the homegrown share is 88% or 70% among those who are teenagers. It's really high. And this is really good news. But it has a real responsibility, too. Because since they're homegrown and they're going to stay here, they're committed to staying, and they leave it. Their migration rate is 1/3 the out-migration of people who are born in other states. 1/3. So they're committed to stay here, but there's a responsibility or a problem that we bear. And that is, if they grew up here, they also went to school here. California schools. And we're going to get what we reaped. Or we're going to reap what we sowed. So there's an interesting dilemma there. Before, you could say, I'm just going to import the talent. And you've heard what PPIC is saying. You can't import enough people. It's not going to work. Well, it's not going to work, but thank God we have them at home here if we just figure how to use them. And I'll give you one number on that in a minute. But first, let's talk about those houses. This is my projection. It's actually in my book, Chapter 11, on who's going to buy your house. Who's going to buy your house? This is for California in 1 year, the year 2020. And I figured out how many buyers, how many sellers, by what age group and what ethnicity they're going to be, according to normal housing market behavior. And then you multiply it through, and you have these sellers here at older ages. This is age 75. These are the gray hairs. These are the non-Hispanic whites. And there's a lot of Latino sellers, too, because they've been homeowners for a long time, and they get older also, and they sell. And the buyers are down here, and these are, half of them are Latino buyers. So if you're like me, you worry, of course, who's going to buy your house. And we always wonder about how is it possible that house prices are as high as they are, even though they've fallen, they're still ridiculously high. And who could possibly afford a house like this? Good question. Really good question. Who could afford a house like this? Especially if it's going to be half of those are Latinos. Are they able to pay a price like this? Well, one fact I found in the census data from 2000 is that Latinos who have a high school degree, versus a college degree. The ones with a college degree, on average, pay prices 64% higher. So you wonder who you want to have come knocking on your door at that moment of truth. Are they a college-educated kid that you really invested in, or are they the high school kid, or are they, worst of all, are they a dropout who's not even trying to buy your house. So we have a problem here. Who's going to buy your house? Well, there's a solution. It's a generational solution. It's a demographic solution. It's the obvious solution. It's the one that's true in every single country in the world. Every culture has the same solution, but it hasn't existed so much in our state because we're a state of migrants that didn't see the full cycle. Now we can see this cycle. And it's basically, you have to pay money out of these pockets here. These mature people who have paid the maximum taxes, the red dollar signs is money out of their pockets. And it goes to these kids up here. You're investing in the next generation. And then it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out. Those kids 20 years later become the adults over here. They're the replacement adults, the new workers, the new taxpayers, and the new home buyer. And you invest in them, and then they become the mature adults themselves, and they should return the favor of making maximum tax contributions themselves, and everybody gets to be rewarded as a senior. Over time, everybody changes roles here so that there's not really a separate interest. There may be at a moment in time, but over time, I get to be a kid, I get to be a mature adult, I get to be a senior, and it's a cycle. And it doesn't matter what ethnicity the kids are. You need to have those kids or else the senior ratio is going to kill you. We've got to keep the senior ratio hoisted up. And the only way you can do that is by actually bulking up the younger generation because they have to carry more load. And so it's an interesting problem what to do about that. That's the narrative of California's future. We have a younger population who can really help us. But what about those house prices? What's going to actually happen? And what is this going to mean? So I just start with take a low scenario, 2% increase. 2% increase per year, actually right now I'd be kind of happy with that. 2% is not bad. If you have a 10% down payment, the power of leveraging means that 10% down payment turns into, your down payment turns into $81,000 instead of $40,000. It's a 15% increase per year in 5 years. That's not a bad return. What can you get in a CD right now? 1.5% per year, so it's 2%. It's nothing to sniff at. But we in California, we expect better. I mean, I do. How can we avoid it? We're so used to those 10% increases. Do you know in the last 34 years, how many years it's been that house prices have increased at least 10% or more? 16 times. More than half the years. So, of course, we don't expect it, but we hope for it. Because it's not unreasonable. It's more often than the Lakers win the championship. So let's go for over 10%. Well, it's just nobody's saying that's going to happen. Not one real estate expert is saying 10%. The highest number I've found is 6% might happen. And there's other numbers that are much worse, like pointing to Japan. What happened in the 1990s of the lost decade? They had a big asset bubble crash and they stayed down. I don't think that's going to happen here. I don't want that to happen here. So I'm not even going to chart that one. Or a Great Depression, and people say, oh, forget that. We got that under control. We got stimulus. It's not going to happen. So those low ones aren't going to happen. So here's what I think might happen. Richard Green, our Lust Center director, says 4%. He says 4% might be an average house price increase that you could hope for. Other people say, well, there is the 7-year recovery theory. 7 years, that's based on the 1990s, which might be possible. I have something about the baby boomer sell-off and say, well, maybe it's 4%, but after 2015, the boomers start selling off, and that kind of dampens it down. So we'll have that scenario. So here's my, here's basically the house prices, and here we are down at the bottom down here. And which way does it go? Well, all of a sudden, magically, it starts going 4%. That's the best scenario. Or it continues to slump, and then it rebounds at 4%. But something in that range in here. But whatever it is. Here is the 2003 acquisition year. These buyers are assessed at this level. This is their Prop 13 assessment. 2% per year, it's increasing. This does not get back up to their level. They remain below their assessment. The Prop 8 is only a temporary decline in value, and as your value rises, they just sort of take it away from you until you get back up to your Prop 13 level. There's a whole generation here, 3 million California homeowners who are kind of locked out of Prop 13 benefits. They're not going to get the future increases because they're below, and when they recover, they don't get up to this level. There's a lot of buyers in here. And so they're kind of locked out of it. New people come along today and say, aha, I'm going to buy now. I can lock in my low assessment. Maybe. It might work, but it's not like it was before. Before, back in these days, back here, that's all they saw was extrapolation of unlimited price increases. We don't see that today. I think it undermines that. So this has an impact on actual voter opinion. People have been saying that Prop 13 is a constant, that there's been no change over the decades, no change, and that people like Prop 13 the same today as they did in 1978. And Mark DiCamillo has done a number of tests on that, showing other attitudes have shifted dramatically, like attitudes towards gay marriage, for example. Lots of things have changed dramatically over 30 years. And yet Prop 13 mysteriously is kind of constant, and it turns out it's a coincidence. 1978 was the peak of a boom. 2008 was the peak of a boom. People hadn't realized it was going to go down like it is. And so it turns out that people vote differently when there's rising prices than when there's falling prices. So I found a survey that PPIC had done in 1998. That's a good time. That's at the end of a crash. The recovery had started, but we had a whole decade of low house prices. And so I'm graphing for you the percentage of people who support the idea of unequal taxes for people who buy more recently. And when things are booming, there's a lot more support for that, especially here among liberal homeowners or conservative homeowners. But back in 1998, it was a lot lower support. And the difference is right here. It was like 48% versus 40% of all voters. Among homeowners, it's 10 percentage points difference. And the difference between 46% and 56% is night and day. So there's the likelihood here that voter support is actually crumbling because of the house prices. But the fiscal impacts are crumbling because we lost all the extra revenue that was expected. We had to give it back under Prop 8. And that extra revenue was needed to give the discounts to the seniors who are getting the low taxes. The system is crumbling from the bottom. And it's also eroding from voter support. So charting our future course, just a few final thoughts. Which image do you think are the most outdated and should change the way we make policy in California? My thesis is that we make policy based on the old images, which we've grown accustomed to, and we're still just now waking up to the new California, which is different on all these scores, not only demographic, but also based on house prices. So here's the old narrative. I think this is the new narrative. I think the new California, the decade ahead, looks like this. And it's a reality of a new responsible California. What I read in the business section is you can no longer use your house as an ATM. That probably also applies to government. The government can no longer use your house as an ATM. You can't count on the rising prices. And the buyers, they don't show up out of nowhere. You have to cultivate. Somebody has to cultivate the future buyers. There's a shortage. You've got to cultivate them. And further, that public investment is not free the way it may have seemed in 1978. Somebody has to pay for public investment. It doesn't come free. And it's us. We're responsible for our own future, making the best possible future for the state. And it really is our own future. It's not somebody else's future. It's not some other group. We're all tied in it together. The thing about house prices that's so interesting is that you need to have this transaction with a buyer and a seller, and they're connecting hands across age groups and even across ethnic groups, but it's a partnership. You can't sell your house without a buyer, and a buyer can't get a house without a seller. So we have this transaction, a market transaction that ties us together politically. So final thought then, I think you have to educate the homegrown population. That's really the only solution. And it doesn't necessarily mean throw more money at it. You might need a reform of how we do with the education. My wife's a teacher. My mother's a teacher. But it might also mean more financial aid for higher ed to help kids go to college. You get the extra degree so they can pay the extra price for my house, thank God, when the time comes. And then how do you create a governance system that's forward-regarding or future-regarding? Because we make our decisions in the present, always based on self-interest and immediate perceptions, which are based on the last couple of years, which then lasts for 30 years. That's the scary thought about it. If I could change my mind tomorrow, I'd be okay with that. But we get locked in for a long time based on a momentary whim. And how do you get the voters to think ahead? That's the biggest challenge. And the one I'm going to keep working on because I don't know what else to do. So thank you.